Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a bin of what I refer to as a mix of red worms. There's a couple other names for it, but to me that seems like the most descriptive name. It's got a variety of different types of worms in it, composting worms that is. There's red wigglers, there's European night crawlers, there's Indian blue worms. And it's a pretty effective mix of different types of worms that live well together, work well together. And this little system here is one of the smallest containers that I have that I use for worm composting. In this case, this particular population of worms had been living in a spot where I started really encountering problems in that system, and I felt like I had lost pretty much the majority of the worms that were living in that system. Poor things. But I was able to rescue a handful of them, and with the help of the viewers, we came up with a rough estimate of about 3 dozen worms that were still alive, and I took those worms and launched off a new system to see if I could limp them back to prosperity. And that was 12 weeks ago now. Our last check-in on this system was when the system was 10 weeks of age, 2 weeks ago. And, well, I've got some information here about this box. Before we get started, let's just review it together quickly. So 84 days of age. Last feeding was 12 days ago, and that was feeding number 6, so they're due for feeding number 7 now, 2 weeks later. I checked out the video from last time. They got some bits of pumpkin, some pieces of moldy bread. And even though there was a fairly small number of worms that I started this system with, I feel like over the past 84 days they've really managed to recover nicely in terms of their numbers. So that coffee filter that was spread out across the top of the container here that I removed a moment ago, that was just there to show us where we last fed. And that was right down here in the middle. I'm just looking at all these little white spots, and I'm questioning whether they're perhaps bits of grit, because the grit that I use is white. It's pulverized eggshell, looks like this. Sometimes when you see little tiny white stuff in your bin, especially if after a while it starts to vanish, it's not just sitting there, it's moving. Those might be springtails. I don't really have springtails in many of my systems, but here I seem to have them, and I think in most places you would consider springtails as welcome occupants in a worm bin. They're just there helping break down the materials in the bin. Now we're kind of making our way down into the feeding area, where I had evidently used a fairly generous application of bedding. This is my prepared bedding. It's just a bunch of shredded paper, newspaper, cardboard. Kind of looks like this before it enters the worm bin. And eventually it'll all just, look like this. The worms will eat the bedding the same as they eat their food. So I guess the really nice thing about this system is that every time I come in here, I'm always reminded of the fact that this system started with so few worms, but I always do seem to find lots and lots of worms in here. It seems like those very few worms that were moved in here 84 days ago proceeded to start mating and have evidently more or less bounced back at this point. So I don't think, I don't think the types of food they got last time, stuff like pumpkin, is going to show any signs of leftovers after 2 weeks. I mean, if we had only a handful of worms in here, then that might be the case, but I don't think that is the case anymore. I think we do have a fairly good size population of worms living in here now. I don't know, this is just like a really tough piece of wood or something, but I'm not going to sweat it. Sometimes when I use certain materials, like what we found sprinkled out here on the top surface, some of these dry leaves that I bring in sometimes when I'm collecting these leaves, the machine that I use, it's like a vac and a grinder and a bagger. It also doubles as a leaf blower. It picks up a variety of different things other than leaves occasionally. So I figured we would just start out by redoing the feeding zone for these little guys, and then maybe we can explore the outer edges of the bin a little bit. I did bring down for them a variety of yummy foods. It's a number of different things mixed in this bag, and I've also got a number of used paper towels in here, maybe 3 or 4 of them. So I'm thinking we'll give them another generous portion of bedding to go hand in hand with this feeding today. But instead of my prepared bedding, which I do have on hand here on standby if we need it, but I do want to get rid of these bits of paper towel. And if we feel like we still need some more, we've got the shredded paper and cardboard too. But we might not need it. So let's start in with the bedding. Let's see what we have here. I'm just going to try to spread them out a little bit because I don't want to have just a big clump of something in here that the worms are unable to get into and get all over and eventually nibble away. Wouldn't want to have something that's just a big wad of stuff, so I'm trying to put it in here in such a way that it is kind of spread out and is approachable from all directions. So yeah, we've got a pretty good amount of bedding here at the bottom, and I've got a couple more here we can throw in later, but I thought we might proceed with the application of the food. You know, when I put down some bedding prior to adding the food, I feel like, you know, I'm avoiding placing the frozen foods that I'm putting in right on top of any worms, because I like to freeze the stuff that I'm putting into my worm bins. I mean, not always, but in most cases I do. And we've got a variety of stuff in here. This is a tomato. Never really got ripe. It was from my garden. I bought in a bunch of green tomatoes, and some ripened, some didn't, some started rotting. These cherry tomatoes, on the other hand, were store-bought. Here we've got some bits of celery, and I see carrot, peels. Not even sure what some of this other stuff in here is. Might be cauliflower. I was about to say it in Hungarian. Kartofel. So yeah, that's a pretty good size feeding, and some of this stuff, you know, these tomatoes, for example, they're going to bring with them a nice bit of moisture too. Not that the system really needs it. I think the material in here's got a pretty decent moisture content, so there's really nothing to worry about as far as moisture goes. But you know, on that topic, I do sometimes like to treat my worm bins with this stuff, and it's not just plain water. It's got the mosquito dunks solution in here, and like I said, I don't think it's all that important. I don't think it's really needed right now. I didn't see any flying insects coming out of here when we placed in, you know, when we came in here to place in the food. But sometimes I like to just treat that stuff as a preventative measure, even if it's not combating active, living, present insects that are in the bin already. It's really just going in as sort of a way to prevent any sort of outbreaks if any little flying insects should try to move in. So I only had a few more pieces of paper towel. This is actually a napkin, I believe. So it's probably sufficient as far as being a nice, generous amount of bedding to go in hand with their feeding. The, I don't know, the other thing that I've got here, which is also worm food, is my worm chow. And I figured why not just throw a little bit of this stuff on here too for them. I don't know, sometimes it's when I put the worm chow in, that's when I feel compelled to grab some of this prepared bedding, because it's going to sort of blend in with that worm chow and maybe make that worm chow a little bit easier for them to eat since it's mixed in with some bedding. Alright, there we go. So if you look at this, it seems like we've just added almost as much material into here as what would be found in maybe half of this bin already. So it was also my intention to see if we can try to build the entire volume of this thing up a little bit as well while we're in here. So we've got top covering newspaper and our feeding zone indicator, which we'll bring all that stuff back in to cover up with at the end. But before we do, I also want to just take a quick glance at how things on the outer edges of the system are holding up, and then we can start to cover up. I've already hinted a couple of times how we might want to, at some point soon, find a somewhat larger container for these worms to be moved into. because I don't think we're talking about 36 worms in here anymore. I'm sure you would agree, just from seeing what I'm seeing here, which is worms pretty much everywhere. And lots of castings, which I don't think 36 worms would be able to produce this many castings in 12 weeks. We need a small army of little worms doing this in here. And they're doing a great job, I must say. But it does feel like at some point soon we might be pushing our luck in terms of running out of space in here. Especially the way I like to work. You saw how I like to push things up on the edges and move things around. At some point it just feels like we're going to run out of space. Or I'm going to push myself to the point where I just end up making a huge mess because I'm working so close to the edge. But yeah, you can see castings everywhere, worms everywhere within the material. The castings are coming along quite nicely. The whole system has this really nice kind of earthy smell to it, which is, you know, the way you would expect a worm bin to smell. Just smells like a handful of dirt off the forest floor. So things are looking good in here, I must say. I'm very happy to see this. I always was very skeptical when I saw people starting worm systems with a very few number of worms. And this right here could be one of the more extreme cases of starting a system with a very small population. But I think they've bounced back nicely, and I don't even really consider this to be a recovering system anymore. To me, this just seems like another good healthy population, possibly on the verge of outgrowing the relatively small space that they're confined to now. So finding them a new place to live soon might be a pretty good idea. So I'll be thinking about that. I mean, if we had to keep them in here for a little while longer, we could. I would just have to be a little bit more careful to make sure I don't just spill stuff all over the place while I'm working in here. So it looks like our top covering newspaper has torn in half, which is not a problem. I'm not going to worry about it. I just thought that maybe if I can easily unfold it, maybe we can spread it out a little bit better to cover more of the top surface, because it was kind of folded up into a fairly small shape. But I don't mind having a little bit more stuff out on the surface for the worms to play in. Alright. I've somehow managed to unfold this one piece, but I've also in the process put a whole bunch of new tears into it. I had actually thought about possibly replacing this today and just including this piece of paper as bedding to go in with the feeding as well, but I don't know, somehow it seemed like it was holding up good enough to be reused perhaps one more time, but I'm now getting the sense that this will be the last time. So the next time we come in here and I want to put top covering newspaper on once again, I think it's going to have to be a replacement piece. But we have succeeded in spreading it out, almost the entire top surface, which is cool. And the other thing I wanted to do in here, besides give them a quick feeding, was to replace this top covering of plastic which was on here previously. So I plan on decommissioning this particular piece of plastic today, because I've got a little bit of bubble wrap that I thought we would put in here in the place of this. I always want to make sure I'm not leaving behind any little worms stranded on the plastic, and I just saw a worm right here, which I'm going to rescue, get them off. And it was a really small one. It's very easy to miss a worm, especially when they're very small like this, so I just popped another one off of there, another one that was possibly even smaller. And usually after I quit filming and I'm preparing to get rid of one of these older pieces of material that I've decommissioned, I'll probably look at that thing one more time just to make sure we're not stranding any wormies on there. So here's the bubble wrap. It's actually two pieces. I already had one piece, this one, and then I had another similarly sized piece here, which together are almost perfect as far as the top covering goes. And since this is clear plastic and I do want to have worms coming up to play on this piece of newspaper on top, I've also fashioned a piece of cardboard to serve as a shade cover to keep things nice and dark and, you know, cozy for them under here and not put them off by any sort of bright lights and make them feel like they don't want to hang out here because of the bright lights. So we're done with checking in on my worms today, and before I go to put things away and clean things up, I really wanted to just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. It's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.